we are moving on now to, we're still in the Module 4. We're still looking at the nature of proof, the nature of evidence, and so forth, and how to prove our ideas on some of these things. So again, I talked about how, what is proof, what is evidence, how to get to a decision on these things. Then we looked at issues on what are the types of evidences of inspiration. If we're going to, quote, prove the Bible is inspired, well, what kind of arguments are we going to give in support of that? And now we start thinking about inerrancy. Again, it's important we think about justifying inerrancy. We go right back to our premises is that, well, we don't have a skeptical standard where you have to be 100% certain. Again, we reject postmodernism, the idea that we can't get to capital T truth or objective knowledge or that language is inadequate to convey it, which, as a reminder, the fact that people are trying to convince you about the truth of postmodernism when language is inadequate to convey that truth, you wonder why they open their mouths in the first place. So we think about this. The fact is that with those levels of persuasion that we can get to, we think about inerrancy and justifying it. The fact is that it starts with the fact that we know God exists, the Bible is inspired, but this God who is omniscient, who controls the process of inspiration and verbal plenary inspiration, the God who cannot lie, who knows all things, you start putting all this together, you get into, the result is necessarily the Bible must be inerrant if God is producing it. It will be sufficient, it'll be intelligent, it'll be wise, it will reflect the attributes of the being of the true and the living God. So remember, inerrancy is not, well, gee, I went through the Bible and personally haven't found an error yet. It's something that necessarily follows from the being of God and the description of inspiration itself within the Scriptures. Now, that said, again, the problem is that while there aren't errors in the Bible, there are certainly things that are difficult to understand and that a skeptic or a critic or someone might look at this and say, and mistakenly call something an error. Now, with that, this is important that, as you're building your own resource library on being a good Christian leader and a good Christian educator, one of the sets of books, which I'll have listed in the course outline as recommended texts, are books on resolving Bible difficulties. And there are two of the best and the most basic ones. If you bought these two, you would pretty much have everything you need to deal with just about every Bible difficulty that every critic has ever raised. Okay, the first is the Encyclopedia of Bible Difficulties by Gleason Archer. And Archer's, again, goes from Genesis to Revelation and has researched and deals with just about every objection and every difficult passage that critics have raised against the faith. Now, the strength of the Archer text is that he is such a good Old Testament and New Testament scholar with depths of background in language and exegesis, ancient Near Eastern language and cultures, that the fact is he just very quickly resolves most of the issues related to that. The second text, again, is Norm Geisler's book, When Critics Ask. And again, he, in addition to a good linguistic arguments and historical cultural context, clarifications of these. Again, a good philosophical reasoning, spotting logic problems, and so forth. And remember, we don't have to give people, again, tautological certainty levels of proof, okay, when we're answering these things. What we need to do is use reasonable and reliable standards to explain these things. And, very important, again, as honest, fair Christians, is that if you're going to deal with the Book of Mormon or problems with the Book of Mormon or problems with the Quran or problems with the Vedas, guess what? You want to give them and those books the same benefit of the doubt that we want them to give the Bible. So again, treat others the way you want to be treated. Okay, use one standard, have an equitable standard, and use it for everyone. So on that, again, we start thinking about these principles of resolving Bible difficulties. We start out by thinking that, well, these are mistakes ultimately that critics make when they approach a passage in the Bible where it's not actually in error, but they think it's in error. So this is why what we're going to do is give some principles, very basically here, more on this on the discussion boards and on each individual one. And again, I'll have a handout on this, justification of inerrancy and Bible difficulties, which you'll have at your leisure. You can go through the outline here. So first, we think about, principle number one, don't assume that something that is unexplained is unexplainable, okay? And that's the problem with, again, a lot of these objections came through modernism in the late 19th through the 20th century. And again, there's just dozens and dozens and dozens of these things that were raised because biblical archaeology was still in its infancy stages. And again, we didn't have as much knowledge of the language and culture of the Old and New Testament. But especially in the last 100 years, we've got such an overwhelming abundance of knowledge of the ancient Near East, greater depths of knowledge of the languages and culture that frankly, most of these objections have disappeared. And I'll give you a couple of examples. By the way, this basic outline is taken from Norm Geisler's text, When Critics Ask. It's in the first part of the book. I'm just giving you a brief overview of this so you understand. Some of the examples, if you're looking at the physical sciences as opposed to the biblical sciences and theological sciences, right? Remember, a science is a testable area of knowledge. And guess what? You can get theology right, you can get it wrong. It's not an opinion discipline, it's a knowledge discipline. Hence, it's always a science. Now, that said, those who cover physical subjects in the sciences, whether it's you're dealing with physics, whether you're dealing with cosmology, whether you're dealing with weather. The fact is, at one point, these scientists couldn't explain earthquakes, tornadoes, other things that were anomalies. How do you explain, stars disappearing, flares, things like that, meteors? Ancient world people didn't know. But what they tried, they didn't deny the phenomenon. They just kept improving their theories until you had a one-to-one correspondence to explain the phenomenon. So the same is true when we get to explaining issues in the Old and New Testament that are difficulties. For example, it's funny because one of the frequent arguments by the modernists was that, oh, you Christians, you fundamentalists, right? Moses couldn't have written the Pentateuch because there wasn't any writing in 1500 BC. And of course, those Hebrews and those people, they didn't have that kind of writing in Hebrew and things like that. Well, what do you know? Archaeology is our best friend again. So we end up with the discovery of the Tel El Amarna letters, which are clay tablets in Babylonian cuneiform, written from about the 15th century, 1420 to 1380 BC. And what do you know? There's writing in the ancient Near East. And then again, same thing. You look at the Sinai Peninsula, the Shirabith El Khadim site, you see alphabetic inscriptions in Sinai turquoise mines around when? The second millennium BC. We're talking about the time of Abraham. And so we're seeing the miners are writing alphabetic inscriptions in the caves. So was there writing at the time? Yes. Now, I'm not going to cover all of these, again, to this degree, because we don't have 3 or 4 hours to do it. But you can see that, these are common objections. Well, there are plenty of errors in the Bible. Look at these people, making these things up and asserting these things. No, every single one of the objections has a plausible to really good counter-argument and explanation for it, like the idea that the unexplained is unexplainable, like there was no writing at that time. Well, that's just a false assertion. Other tenets, too, is that the fact is you just have skeptics and critics have an anti-supernatural bias. So principle number 2 is you treat the Bible like every other book. It's innocent till proven guilty. Okay, you get a presumption of innocence. You don't assume everything is wrong and say, well, that's wrong until it's proven innocent. Now, again, and that should be self-evident that why we treat any book that way. If you're reading the newspaper, if you're reading the instructions on your medication, you don't treat it as factually incorrect until somehow somebody attests and give you evidence that it's correct. So same thing with you're reading your history book. You don't assume anything is incorrect in it until you've got evidence to the contrary and you have a good argument for it. So again, innocent until proven guilty. Just treat the Bible like any other piece of literature you're going to read in that genre or classification. Next, number 3, again, we have to be careful that we don't confuse a fallible interpretation with fallible revelation, okay? And what does that mean? Well, supposedly, okay, of course, not supposedly, it's true. Yeah, in the ancient world, people had geocentricity, right? As a view about, well, the earth must be the center of the universe and so on and so forth. Well, that wasn't the Bible stating that. That was a fallible interpretation of church fathers and other Christians throughout history. But you don't actually find that in the Bible. So again, we don't want to confuse fallible interpretations of the Bible and say, oh, there you go, the Bible has errors. Again, with what the Bible actually says. Now, we're going to take a break and come back, or try and keep these about 10-minute sections. So we'll pick this up in the next section. Thanks.